Have you ever had someone try to tell you what to do with your own property? It's a uniquely irritating experience, a special kind of invasive entitlement that gets right under your skin. Now, imagine that person has zero legal authority over you. They refuse to believe it. And the property in question isn't a suburban lot with a fussy lawn, but over 300 acres of dense, private forest. That's the situation I found myself in, and it led to a confrontation so meticulously planned and satisfyingly executed that the fallout is still the stuff of local legend. My name is Alex, and for most of my adult life, I worked in a field most people only see in spy movies: geospatial intelligence. My job was to analyze satellite imagery, survey data, and cartographic records to create detailed, unimpeachable maps for sensitive government operations. I lived and breathed boundary lines, topographical data, and the legal minutiae of land rights. It was a high-stress, high-stakes career, and when I retired, all I wanted was the exact opposite. I wanted peace, quiet, and isolation. I found it in a massive, undeveloped parcel of woodland nestled behind a ridge, miles from the nearest town. It was perfect. The land was bordered on one side by a state park, and on the other by a pretentious, high-end housing development called Summit Ridge Estates. I bought my forest, paid in cash, and looked forward to years of quiet hikes and blissful solitude. That bliss lasted exactly 3 weeks until the first certified letter arrived. It was from the Summit Ridge Homeowners Association. The letter, penned by a woman named Carol who identified herself as the HOA board president, was a masterclass in aggressive condescension. It informed me that I was in violation of several community covenants. My lawn, the forest floor, was unkempt. I had failed to submit the paint color for my non-existent cabin for architectural review, and there was an unapproved structure, a dilapidated hunter's blind left by the previous owner, visible from the ridge trail. It concluded with a list of fines totaling over $1,000 and a stern warning of further action. I laughed at first, assuming it was a simple mistake. A quick phone call would clear it up. But what Carol and her board of suburban tyrants didn't know was that my entire professional life had been dedicated to one thing: understanding precisely where lines are drawn and the profound consequences of crossing them. They had just crossed a very big, very well-documented line, and they were about to get a masterclass in why that's a terrible idea. Have you ever dealt with someone so convinced of their own authority that facts become irrelevant? Let me know in the comments, because I promise you, this story of bureaucratic comeuppance will feel deeply, deeply satisfying. I decided to handle the situation with the polite, straightforward approach that any reasonable person would expect. I found the phone number for the Summit Ridge HOA, and after navigating a brief automated menu, was connected to the unmistakable voice of authoritarian certainty, Carol. Summit Ridge HOA, President Carol speaking, she answered, her tone already suggesting I was wasting her valuable time. I explained who I was, the new owner of the large forest parcel adjacent to her development, and that I believe the violation notice I'd received was sent in error. "There's no error, Mr. Alex," she clipped back, mispronouncing my last name with a casual disregard that set my teeth on edge. "Your property falls under the Summit Ridge covenants. The rules were provided to you at closing." I calmly explained that my property was never part of Summit Ridge, that it was a separate, pre-existing parcel with its own deed and title history, recorded decades before the first Summit Ridge home was ever built. "My closing documents make no mention of your HOA," I concluded, "because legally, it has no jurisdiction." There was a sigh on the other end of the line, the kind of weary exhalation one uses on a toddler who just can't grasp a simple concept. "Sir," she said, dripping with condescension, "our community documents clearly state that the HOA's purview extends to all properties visible from the Summit Ridge scenic overlook. It's for a cohesive and pleasant visual aesthetic. Your unkempt land is dragging down our property values. You need to clear the underbrush, remove the derelict structure, and adhere to the community standards." The fines stand. I was momentarily speechless. A visual aesthetic clause? That was legally absurd. It was like claiming ownership of a view. "Carol," I said, my voice losing its friendly edge, "that is not a legally enforceable concept. My property lines are clearly defined by the county surveyor's office. I suggest you consult a real map before you send any more letters." Her response was a cold, sharp laugh. "We have maps, sir. We have our community plat map, approved by the developer. It shows your land as a future development zone under our control. Pay the fines, or our attorney will be in touch to place a lien on your property." With a click, she hung up. That was my first mistake, assuming I was dealing with a rational actor. The second letter arrived a week later, this time from the HOA's lawyer, a name I recognized from local billboards that promised aggressive representation. The letter was full of bluster and legalese, formally threatening a lien and repeating Carol's nonsense about the visual purview. The fines had now doubled due to non-compliance. The escalation was as swift as it was moronic. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was a declaration of war. My desire for a quiet life was being threatened by a petty tyrant who couldn't be bothered to read a county record. My frustration, however, was quickly being replaced by a familiar, cold determination, the kind I used to feel when an adversary's intelligence report was based on flawed data. Carol and her lawyer were operating off a bad map, both literally and figuratively, and I knew, better than almost anyone on the planet, how to exploit that. My quiet retirement was officially over. The peaceful sanctuary I'd purchased had become a battlefield, and the opening shots had been fired by an enemy armed with ignorance and a letterhead. So, I did what I've always done when faced with a territorial dispute. I went to work. I turned my small home office, intended for writing emails and browsing fly fishing websites, into a strategic operations center. I fired up my high-powered workstation, the one piece of professional gear I couldn't part with, and began to gather intelligence. This wasn't just about proving I was right. It was about building a case so airtight, so overwhelmingly definitive, that Carol's position would not just be defeated, but vaporized. First, I accessed the county's digital archives. I pulled the original 1,958 survey plat for my land, a beautiful hand-drawn document that detailed every boundary marker, elevation contour, and easement. Then I cross-referenced it with the official county GIS, Geographic Information System, data which confirmed the lines to a sub-meter accuracy. My property was parcel 734, a standalone tract with a clear and unbroken chain of title going back to a railroad grant in the late 1800s. Next, I focused on Summit Ridge. I pulled their original development plan, filed in 1996. I found their master plat map, the one Carol had mentioned, and that's when I saw it, the source of her delusion. The developer, in a cost-saving move, had commissioned a cheap, quick survey. On their map, the vast expanse of my forest was indeed shaded and labeled Future Development Zone, subject to covenants. But here was the critical detail. The kind of detail a layman like Carol would never understand. In the map's legend, in tiny, almost unreadable print, was a surveyor's note. Boundary adjacent to parcel 734 is approximate and subject to verification with official county records. They had literally drawn a fuzzy line and put a legal disclaimer on it. They knew the boundary wasn't confirmed, but they shaded it in anyway, likely as a marketing tool to make their development seem larger and more exclusive. This was good, but it wasn't the aha moment. It was just the first layer. The real gold was buried in the Summit Ridge HOA's own founding documents, their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC rupees. I spent a full day reading the 80-page document, a monument to corporate legalese and petty rules about lawn gnomes and basketball hoops. And then, on page 67, I found the payload. Article 11, Section 4, Resolution of Disputes. It contained a clause that was probably boilerplate, inserted by the developer's lawyers to cover themselves. It stated, "In any case of a discrepancy or dispute between the association's community plat maps and the officially recorded surveys and records held by the County of Northwood, the county's records shall be considered definitive and shall supersede any and all claims made by the association." It was a self-destruct clause. Carol, in her arrogant crusade, was citing a decorative map as gospel while ignoring the very document that gave her any authority at Allah, document that explicitly stated her map was worthless in a dispute like this. She had handed me the loaded gun and told me where to aim it. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. The initial frustration had completely melted away, replaced by the electric thrill of a well-defined strategy falling into place. Carol thought this was a battle of wills. She was about to find out it was a battle of information, and she was coming to a gunfight armed with a crayon drawing. With the core of my strategy solidified, I knew that simply sending Carol a letter with the evidence wasn't enough. People like her don't respond to quiet correction. They double down, claim the evidence is fake, and attack the messenger. A public refutation was necessary, but I also understood that in a small community, perception is reality. I needed to control the narrative, and to do that, I needed an ally on the inside. My research had given me the names of the HOA board members, but I also found minutes from past annual meetings. One name appeared repeatedly, always voting against Carol's more outlandish proposals and frequently questioning her interpretation of the bylaws, a Mr. Gerald Henderson. A quick search of property records showed he was one of the original homeowners, living in a modest house at the edge of the development, right where his backyard met the tree line of my forest. One afternoon I took a walk along my property line, making sure to stay conspicuously on my side. As I'd hoped, I saw Mr. Henderson in his garden. He was an older gentleman, probably in his late 70s, with a kind but weary face. I gave him a friendly wave. He looked up, a bit startled, but waved back. "You must be the new owner," he called out. "Pleasure to meet you. I'm Gerald." I walked over to the old stone wall that marked the boundary. "Alex," I said, shaking his hand. "Good to meet a neighbor. Hope my unkempt wilderness isn't bothering you," he chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "Son, I've lived here for 25 years. That forest was here long before this neighborhood and its queen bee. Don't you pay her any mind." That was my opening. "Her name's Carol, I take it?" I asked. "I've been receiving some rather enthusiastic correspondence from her." Gerald sighed, leaning on his rake. "Enthusiastic is one word for it. That woman has run this HOA like her personal kingdom for the last decade. She bullies anyone who questions her. Fined me $200 last spring because my bird feeder was attracting non-native species. I'm telling you, the woman is a menace." I spent the next hour talking with Gerald. He confirmed everything I suspected. Carol ruled by intimidation, backed by a passive board who were either her friends or too scared to cross her. She used the HOA's funds to pay a lawyer who was, in Gerald's words, a bulldog who gets paid by the bark. He told me about the upcoming annual homeowners meeting, a mandatory event where the board presented its budget and held votes. "It's her favorite day of the year," Gerald said grimly. "She gets to stand up there and lord her power over everyone. She's already put an item on the agenda about you." He pulled a newsletter from his mailbox. "See for yourself." And there it was, in black and white. New business item 3. Discussion and vote on enforcement actions against parcel 734 for continued covenant violations. She was planning to publicly shame me and get the community to officially sanction her illegal campaign of harassment. It was perfect. "Gerald," I said, a plan crystallizing in my mind. "I'm going to that meeting, and I'm going to end this." But I could use a friendly face in the room. A spark of life returned to his eyes. "What are you planning, son?" I smiled. "I'm a retired cartographer, Gerald. I make maps. And I'm going to present the community with a map they've never seen before. One that shows them exactly where the lines are, in more ways than one." He looked from me to the deep woods behind me, then back again. A slow grin spread across his face. "I'll save you a seat," he said. The trap was now baited. Carol, in her supreme overconfidence, was not only walking toward it, she was actively assembling the audience for her own humiliation. The weeks leading up to the Summit Ridge HOA annual meeting were a period of intense, quiet preparation. My mission was no longer simply defensive, it was a full-blown strategic operation. I channeled the discipline and meticulousness of my former career into creating a presentation that would be an irrefutable public dismantling of Carol's authority. My primary weapon would be visual. People, especially a group of homeowners in a community hall, respond to clear, powerful graphics far more than they do to dry legal recitations. I spent over 40 hours at my workstation, creating a series of large-format presentation boards. The first was a stunning, high-resolution satellite image of the entire area. I overlaid the official county-verified property lines in a bold, bright red. My 300-acre parcel was clearly delineated. A vast green sea next to the neat, orderly grid of Summit Ridge. In a pale, transparent yellow, I then overlaid the HOA's claimed visual purview, showing how it absurdly attempted to annex my land. The second board was a timeline. It started with the 1958 survey of my property, followed by the 1996 founding of the HOA, and culminated in a chronological list of every letter, fine, and threat I had received from Carol. Each entry was documented with dates and copies of the correspondence. The third and final board was the kill shot. It was an enlarged, annotated version of the Summit Ridge Plat-Maffer map. I used bright call-out boxes to highlight the surveyor's nearly invisible disclaimer about the approximate boundary. Beside it, I printed Article 11, Section 4 of their own CCRs in a massive 72-point font. In any case of a discrepancy, the county's record shall be considered definitive and shall supersede any and all claims. I also contacted my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright, who specialized in property law. I didn't want her to fight my fight for me, but to act as a closing argument. I briefed her on the entire situation and had her draft a formal cease and desist letter, as well as a preliminary filing for a harassment lawsuit against Carol personally and the HOA board collectively, citing financial damages for the fraudulent fines and emotional distress. This was the ace up my sleeve, ready to be played at the moment of maximum impact. As the day of the meeting approached, Carol's arrogance seemed to grow. One morning, while I was walking near the edge of my property, she drove by in her golf cart, which she used to patrol the neighborhood like a pint-sized general. She stopped and glared at me. "I hope you're planning to attend the annual meeting, Mr. Alex," she called out, her voice dripping with smug triumph. "The community is very eager to discuss your situation. We will be voting on placing a permanent lien on your land until you clear out this eyesore." She gestured vaguely at the ancient, beautiful oaks and pristine forest floor. I just gave her a calm, placid smile. "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for the world, Carol," I replied. "I'm actually looking forward to it." My lack of fear or anger seemed to confuse her. She narrowed her eyes, searching for a weakness, but found none. She huffed, spun her golf cart around with a spray of gravel, and sped off. She thought she was preparing for a public execution where she was the executioner. She had no idea that she was the one being led to the gallows, and that the entire community was about to watch her spring the trap on herself. The evening of the annual meeting arrived, thick with the kind of suburban tension that could be cut with a plastic knife. The venue was the Summit Ridge Community Center, a sterile beige room with fluorescent lighting that buzzed faintly overhead. The air smelled of stale coffee and self-importance. About 50 or 60 homeowners were scattered in folding chairs, looking variously bored, annoyed, or, in the case of a few sitting near the front, devotedly sycophantic. These were Carol's lieutenants. I saw Gerald Henderson near the back and gave him a subtle nod as I entered. I was carrying a large, black portfolio case containing my presentation boards. I leaned it against the wall near the podium, an unrevealed piece of ordnance waiting for its target. I took a seat next to Gerald, who gave my arm a reassuring squeeze. "Showtime," he whispered, a glint of excitement in his eye. At the front of the room, Carol sat at a long table flanked by her bored two men and a woman who all wore identical expressions of pained seriousness, like they were presiding over a war tribunal instead of a discussion about recycling bin placement. Carol, in a sharp blazer with shoulders that seemed to defy gravity, beamed with authority. She banged a small gavel, and the room fell silent. "Welcome, everyone, to the 28th annual meeting of the Summit Ridge Estates Homeowners Association," she began, her voice resonating with practiced confidence. She droned on for the better part of an hour, going through the budget, minutes from the last meeting, and updates from the Architectural Review Committee. It was a stunning performance of bureaucratic theater. My pulse was steady, a calm thrum of anticipation. This was the part of the operation where you listen, observe, and wait for the perfect moment to act. I let her control the tempo, build her own narrative, and climb higher and higher on her pedestal of perceived power. The higher she climbed, the harder the fall would be. Finally, she arrived at the main event. "And now," she announced, her voice taking on a graver tone, "we move to new business item number 3, enforcement actions against parcel 734. A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to me. Carol savored the moment, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "As many of you know," she continued, "the large undeveloped parcel bordering our scenic trail has a new owner. Despite our repeated good faith efforts to welcome him to the community and inform him of his obligations, he has refused to comply with our standards." She clicked a button, and a projector screen flickered to life. It showed a grainy, zoomed-in photo of the old hunter's blind on my property. "This derelict structure is an eyesore and a safety hazard." Click! A photo of some fallen leaves on the forest floor. "The grounds are completely unmaintained, a violation of Covenant 7.4. She went on, listing the bogus violations and the mounting fraudulent fines. She then displayed her coup de grace, a cheap, black-and-white photocopy of the developer's plat map, the one with the fuzzy, shaded area. "As you can see from our official community map," she declared, pointing a pen at the screen, "this parcel is clearly designated as part of our jurisdiction. The owner's refusal to cooperate is a direct threat to our property values and the aesthetic harmony we have all worked so hard to build." She turned to the audience. "The board proposes a motion to place a permanent lien on parcel 734 and to authorize our legal counsel to use all necessary means to force compliance. Do I have a second?" One of her cronies at the front immediately piped up. "I second the motion." "All in favor?" Carol asked, her eyes sweeping the room, daring anyone to object. This was it. The trap was set. The bait was taken. It was my turn to speak. As Carol's call for a vote hung in the air, a confident, predatory gleam in her eye, I calmly stood up. "Point of order, Madam President," I said, my voice clear and even, easily carrying through the tense silence of the room. Every head swiveled in my direction. Carol looked momentarily flustered, her script interrupted. "This isn't a town hall debate, Mr. Alex," she snapped. "We are in a formal vote, according to your own bylaws," I countered, holding up the thick document I had printed out. "Article 3, Section 2, a homeowner subject to a motion has the right to address the board before a vote is cast. I'd like to exercise that right." A few people started murmuring and flipping through their own copies of the bylaws. Carol, trapped by her own rules, gritted her teeth. "Fine," she hissed. "You have 2 minutes." "Thank you," I said, walking to the front of the room. "I won't need that long." I picked up my portfolio case and walked to the easel standing next to the projector screen. With a deliberate motion, I unzipped it and pulled out my first presentation board, the high-resolution satellite map, with the bold red lines of my property and the pale yellow ghost of her HOA's claim. I placed it on the easel, dwarfing her flimsy photocopy. A collective gasp went through the room. The visual was immediate and undeniable. "This," I began, using a laser pointer I'd brought, "is what the world actually looks like. This red line is the legal boundary of my property, parcel 734, as surveyed, verified, and recorded by Northwood County. This line," I said, circling the neat grid of Summit Ridge, "is you. As you can all plainly see, they are not the same thing. They do not overlap. They do not intersect. They are entirely separate." I then moved the pointer to the faint yellow overlay. "This yellow area is what your president is claiming jurisdiction over. It is a claim based on nothing more than a feeling, a desire for a nice view." I saw Carol's face turning from smug to crimson. Her board members were starting to look distinctly uncomfortable. "Now, Carol mentioned your official community map," I continued, smoothly swapping the satellite image for my second board, the annotated version of her own map. "Let's take a closer look at that, shall we?" I pointed the laser at the tiny disclaimer in the legend, now blown up for all to see. Boundary adjacent to parcel 734 is approximate and subject to verification with official county records. It says right here on your own founding document that the line is an approximation, a guess. It's legally meaningless without verification, which, as we saw from the county's data, invalidates your claim entirely. The murmuring in the room grew louder. People were leaning forward, pointing, whispering to their neighbors. The foundation of Carol's argument was visibly crumbling before their eyes. She tried to interrupt, sputtering, That's just your interpretation. Our lawyer has reviewed." I cut her off, my voice turning from informative to iron hard. "Your lawyer reviewed what you gave him. I, on the other hand, reviewed the document that gives this HOA its power. The CC, rupees." I replaced the map with my final board, the one with Article 11, Section 4 in giant letters. I read it aloud, slowly and deliberately. In any case of a discrepancy or dispute between the association's community plat maps and the officially recorded surveys and records held by the County of Northwood, the county's records shall be considered definitive and shall supersede any and all claims made by the association. I let the words hang in the dead silent room for a long moment. I turned from the board to face the homeowners directly. This isn't a dispute, it's a fact. Your own bylaws, the very rules your president claims to be enforcing, state unequivocally that in this exact situation, she is wrong. The county record is law. Her claim is void. I then looked directly at Carol. Her face was a mask of pure, undiluted rage and shock. The trap had sprung. The silence that followed my final statement was profound. It was the sound of 50 people simultaneously processing a paradigm shift. The world they knew, one governed by Carol's iron-fisted interpretation of the rules, had just been proven to be a complete fabrication. Carol, for her part, was visibly trembling, her face pale with fury. She looked like a statue cracking from the inside out. "This is an outrage," she finally shrieked, finding her voice. "You can't just come in here with your fancy doctored maps and—" "They aren't doctored, Carol," I said, my voice cutting through her tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. "They are public records. Everything I have presented here is verifiable with a 5-minute search on the county's public website. The only person presenting false information tonight is you." She turned desperately to her board members, but found no support. Their faces were ashen. They stared at the giant printout of their own bylaw, the self-destruct clause, as if seeing a ghost. They knew they were caught. Then, a new voice emerged from the back of the room. It was Gerald Henderson. He stood up, his posture straighter than I'd ever seen it. "I'd like to make a motion," he said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. "I move for a vote of no confidence in our president, Carol, on the grounds of gross misrepresentation of the governing documents and willful harassment of a landowner." "Seconded?" A woman from the side shouted immediately. Another man stood up. "I want to know how much of our money she spent on her lawyer for this personal vendetta. I demand a full audit of the HOA's legal expenditures for the past 5 years." Suddenly, the dam broke. The room erupted not in chaos, but in a focused, unified wave of dissent directed squarely at the head table. People who had been silent for years, cowed by Carol's bullying, were now on their feet, demanding answers, questioning past fines, and recounting their own stories of her overreach. Carol stood frozen, watching her kingdom dissolve in real time. Her power had never been based on law or fact. It was based on bluff and intimidation. And I had just called her bluff in the most public way imaginable. At that moment, a calm, professionally dressed woman who had been sitting quietly in the back row stood and walked to the front. It was my lawyer, Miss Albright. She approached the table and placed a thick envelope in front of Carol and another in front of the stunned vice president. "Carol, members of the board," she said, her voice professional and devoid of emotion. "My name is Sarah Albright. I represent Mr. Alex, the owner of parcel 734. This document is a formal cease and desist, demanding an immediate end to all harassment, communication, and fraudulent financial claims against my client. It also serves as official notice of our intent to file a civil suit against the Summit Ridge HOA for damages, and against you, Carol, personally, for slander and malicious harassment. Any further action against my client will be met with the full force of legal consequence." The word personally landed in the room like a physical blow. The color drained completely from Carol's face. The specter of her own money being on the line was the final nail in her coffin. She sank back into her chair, utterly defeated. The motion for a vote of no confidence was called. It wasn't even close. It was nearly unanimous. Carol was stripped of her presidency on the spot. Her reign was over. The lieutenants who had supported her stared at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The room was filled with a sense of dizzying, cathartic release. They hadn't just watched a takedown, they had participated in a revolution. The fallout from that meeting was swift and decisive. It was as if a spell had been broken over the Summit Ridge community. The vote of no confidence in Carol was just the beginning. In the ensuing chaos, the entire board resigned en masse within 48 hours, unwilling to face the legal storm brewing or the newfound wrath of their neighbors. An emergency election was held the following week, and a new board was voted in. Unsurprisingly, Gerald Henderson was unanimously elected as the new president. His first official act was to formally draft a letter of apology to me on behalf of the entire HOA. The letter acknowledged their complete lack of jurisdiction, rescinded all fines, and purged any mention of the violations from their records. As requested by the homeowners at the meeting, Gerald also commissioned a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances going back a decade. The results were damning. The auditors discovered that Carol had been using the HOA's legal fund as her personal slush fund to intimidate residents over petty issues, spending tens of thousands of dollars on legal letters for things like unapproved garden gnomes and holiday decorations left up a day too long. The revelations led to a separate civil action brought by the HOA itself against Carol to recoup the misspent funds. The lawsuit from my attorney was strategically placed on hold. Ms. Albright advised that the public humiliation, loss of power, and the internal lawsuit from her own community were a far more fitting and potent punishment than anything we could achieve in court. We sent a bill for my legal consultations to the HOA, which the new board paid immediately and gratefully and officially closed the matter. Carol's downfall was total. She and her husband put their house on the market less than a month later and moved away, unable to withstand the shame and the cold shoulders of the community she once terrorized. The last I heard, they had downsized to a condominium in a different state tone, I imagine, with a very different and much clearer set of rules. For me, the victory was sweeter than I could have anticipated. Yes, I had my peace and quiet back. My forest was once again a sanctuary, free from the threat of certified letters and imaginary violations. But something more had been achieved. I had inadvertently become a catalyst for positive change. Gerald and his new board rewrote the most ambiguous and draconian parts of the CCRs, transforming the HOA from an instrument of petty tyranny into a genuinely functional and reasonable community organization. They even hosted a good neighbor barbecue, and I was the guest of honor. I brought a large, framed copy of the official county map of my land as a housewarming gift for the community center to hang where Carol's phony one once was. It was a gentle, permanent reminder of the importance of facts. Looking back on the whole affair, I realize I learned a valuable lesson. I had bought my forest seeking isolation, a retreat from a world of conflict and lines on a map. I wanted to be left alone, to build a wall between my life and the rest of society. But the world has a funny way of finding you. Carol's aggression forced me out of my self-imposed exile. It forced me to engage, to draw on the very skills I was trying to leave behind. And in doing so, I didn't just protect my own peace, I helped a whole community find theirs. I had inadvertently become a better neighbor by refusing to be one. My greatest weapon wasn't anger or aggression, but precision. It was the calm, methodical application of facts. In a world that feels increasingly driven by loud opinions and emotional declarations, there is a profound and unshakable power in quiet competence and verifiable truth. Carol's empire was built on bluster and belief. It collapsed under the weight of a single, undisputed fact. That's the real moral of this story. Don't let bullies, whether they're in an HOA or anywhere else in life, define the reality of your situation. Do your homework. Know your ground both literally and figuratively. Stand firm, not on outrage, but on evidence. An argument built on emotion can be swayed, but a fortress built on facts is impregnable. When you are armed with the truth, you don't need to shout. Your confidence comes from knowing the lines are already drawn in your favor. All you have to do is reveal them. Today, my forest is as quiet as I ever hoped it would be. I take long hikes, listen to the birds, and I never ever see a golf cart patrolling my perimeter. My neighbors in Summit Ridge are friendly and respectful. We wave when we see each other. They have their community, and I have my sanctuary. The line between us is clear, understood, and, most importantly, peaceful. And that, in the end, was all I ever wanted. What's the most ridiculous rule you've ever had to deal with? I'm genuinely curious to hear your stories. Thanks for reading, and remember to always check the map.